The next concept we're going to deal with is hoisting. This is a concept that sometimes gets ignored because it may be considered basic, but it is still relevant. So let's talk about hoisting. So to hoist means to lift or raise. And hoisting in JavaScript refers to variables and function declarations that are lift or raised to the top of your code. Now, that is a definition that helps illustrate the effects of hoisting. However, it makes it sound like the JavaScript engine is moving your code. That is not happening. Here's a more technical definition for reference. So, during the compile phase, which takes place right before your code is executed, the code is scanned for function and variable declarations, which are then added to the memory. This allows them to be used even before they're actually declared in the source code. So what does all this mean practically? Well, this simply means that you can reference them before they are declared. Because they are raised to the top, the JavaScript engine knows they exist, will not give you an error when you try to reference those variables, or in the case of a function declaration, it will be able to find that function and invoke it. So that's basically what hoisting is. But let's take a look at some examples to illustrate it better. So let me jump to Sublime. All right, here I have a simple function. Hoisting is what I've called this function. It has 3 console log statements. The first one logs to the console hoist. Notice where hoist is declared and a value is assigned to it. Clear down here. We then declare a variable what and assign the value of this statement, variable and function declarations, and then we log to the console what is hoisted and that variable. Then the very last console log statement, hoist means and the hoist variable, which is defined here. So let's invoke this function and see what happens with these variables. One other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to invoke that function from up here. So I will invoke it before it has been defined. So let me go ahead and save that and let's see what happens. Refresh, open the console. All right, so first thing we should notice is that the function did invoke, it did execute. Even though we called it up here and it was declared at line 3, it still executed. So function declarations are hoisted to the top so that we can define them anywhere in our code and they're available for us throughout that same scope. We don't have to declare the function first and then call it down here. Now, what happened with the variables? First, the console.log statement for hoist. Notice that it indicates undefined. Now, it did not give us an error. Normally, if a variable does not exist, we receive an error in JavaScript. For example, let me just comment this out. Save it. Come back. Refresh. And notice we get an error this time. Uncaught reference error. Hoist is not defined. We receive that because nowhere within the scope of function hoisting is the variable hoist being declared. Therefore, we receive an error. But if it is declared, the JavaScript engine knows that it exists, and so no error is generated. However, the results are undefined because it knows the variable exists, but the variable does not have a value yet. That value is assigned down here at line 10. So it simply prints undefined. Now with these other log statements, we don't have any issues because it is accessing the variable after it's already been declared and a value has been assigned to it. So the variable hoist was hoisted to the top, meaning all the code inside this scope knew that it existed. It didn't have a value until line 10, till the JavaScript engine had processed to line 10, but this statement knew that it existed, so it did not generate an error. For the function declaration, the JavaScript engine knows it exists and that it is a function, and so when we invoke it, it finds it and executes the code within. All right, let me delete this and add another example. This time I'm going to create a function expression, not a function declaration, because I want to show you the difference. This function is simply going to log to the console the sum of two numbers. And those numbers are declared down here. We'll check out that hoisting of variables again. Now the other thing I'm going to do, I'm going to try to call that function up here. Just like we did with the function declaration. This time it's a function expression, and we'll try to call it before it is defined. All right, let me save that, jump out, refresh. We get an error. Sum is not a function. So the JavaScript engine knows that sum exists. For example, if we were not trying to invoke it, we wouldn't get the error. So it knows that it exists, but it does not know it's a function because a value has not been assigned to that variable yet. And the value that gets assigned is a function. And so it's trying to execute something that it says, right now, it's not a function. I don't know that it's not a function, so it generates an error. So with the function expression, the call must be after the function is declared. Not true with the function declaration. Now, when we try to add those numbers together, we get NEN. Because right now, it sees these as undefined and tries to add them together. Does not give us an error because it knows they exist, but since they are undefined, it's not able to add them together. So we place it up there, and we get the correct number. I should mention, in case there's some wondering or some confusion, an arrow function is a function expression, so the same thing applies. Now, so far we've been using var for our declarations, but what happens if we use const or let? Let's take a look at that. I've commented out the previous code, and now let me add a log statement for a variable declared with let. Let's go ahead and do that down here. So first we'll put the console log statement in, and then right below it we'll declare it. Let's see what happens. We get an uncaught reference error, cannot access none before initialization. So are let and const variables not hoisted? Well, that statement is not exactly true. All declarations, function, var, let, const, and class are hoisted. However, the var declarations are initialized with undefined. But let and const and class declarations remain uninitialized. And so that's why we get the error that we're seeing here, because it is not initialized. Let's make a change and look at that same code again. So I'm going to come up here and just declare the variable, and then down here we'll add the value to it. Save that, and let's do this again. Now you can see that we get an undefined, similar to what we would get if we had done that with var. And so in that case, it's undefined. So, after all of this, what do we gain? What do we learn? Well, first thing I want to recommend is that you don't rely on hoisting. Realize that it is there and understand it to avoid bugs, but follow practices that will help avoid relying on hoisting. So let's look at what some of those may be. So first, declare variables at the top of their respective scope. So if it's in a global space, at the top of that, or at the top of a function, at the top of a module, that's where you should declare your variables. Also, always try to initialize your variables when you declare them. Give them a value. That's a good practice as well. And then this third item, this is one that I follow. It may not be recommended by other JavaScript developers, but I like it because it helps make my code much cleaner. And I use function expressions instead of function declarations almost always. So, for example, instead of doing this, I would do this. So this is a function expression, and this is function declaration. This is not hoisted, as we have seen, and this forces you to declare the functions before they are used. And I think that makes cleaner code. So those are a few rules to follow when you take into account hoisting in JavaScript. All right, let's move on.